Every new year, the house felt heavier. The air carried the lingering warmth of candles, the faint scent of pine, and the sharp, cold edge of winter pressed against the windows. I liked these mornings, when the world outside was quiet and pale, and the house seemed to breathe slowly around me. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath my bare feet, each sound amplified in the stillness. I moved deliberately, savoring the comfort of familiarity. The living room smelled faintly of old wood polish, mixed with the lingering aroma of yesterday's baking. I ran my fingers along the edge of the coffee table, feeling the smooth wood and tiny scratches, tracing familiar patterns that anchored me in the ordinary. The walls, painted a faded cream, caught the soft light of the early morning sun, casting long, shifting shadows across the carpet. I opened an old drawer where my parents kept boxes of photographs. The smell of aged paper and faint mildew rose from the stack. Each photo felt heavy in my hands, capturing moments of birthdays, celebrations, and New Year's long past. I had spent countless hours looking at them, tracing the faces of family members with my eyes, memorizing the angles of smiles, the way someone's hair fell, the subtle tilt of a head. It was a ritual, a comforting ritual. But this year, as I flipped through the photos, a quiet unease began to creep in. Something felt different. I paused on a picture of last year's New Year dinner. The family was gathered around the table, candles flickering, faces smiling. Everything seemed ordinary, and yet something at the edge of my vision made my chest tighten. A shadow? A stray reflection? I leaned closer, studying the photo carefully. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the frame, partially obscured by the shadows of the room. Someone who shouldn't be there. The shape was vague, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. My breath caught, and I felt the faint chill of fear crawl along my spine. I looked at the other photos, each one a familiar scene. Birthdays, previous New Year's, vacations. And in almost every picture, there was a figure I did not recognize. Always in the background, sometimes just a shadow, sometimes more distinct, always silent, always observing. I put the photos down on the table, my fingers trembling slightly. The room felt colder now. The shadows seemed to cling more tightly to the corners, stretching and shifting with the light. I heard the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards, sounds I had always ignored, but now seemed amplified, deliberate. I thought of my family, asleep in their rooms, unaware. Were they seeing it too? Had they always seen it and chosen not to speak? My mind raced, filling in gaps with explanations I did not trust. Reflections, tricks of the camera, my imagination. But the certainty lingered, patient and insistent. Something was wrong, and it had always been there, hiding in plain sight. I sat down, feeling the weight of the photographs in my hands. I traced the outline of the unknown figures with my eyes, noting the subtle changes from year to year, the faint consistencies in posture, in placement, in expression. They were always present, just beyond comprehension, threading themselves quietly into the fabric of our family history. The air seemed to press in around me, heavier, colder, almost alive. I felt a quiet panic, not loud, not urgent, but persistent, creeping slowly, pressing against the edges of my awareness. I told myself to breathe, to remember that it was just photos, just memories. And yet, the feeling would not be denied. The house was silent. The candles from the night before had burned out, leaving faint pools of wax on the table. The shadows shifted imperceptibly, and I knew with a slow, creeping certainty that the figures were not just in the photos, they were in the rhythm of our lives, patient, observing, waiting. That night I couldn't sleep. The images from the photos replayed in my mind like a loop, the figures in the background shifting slightly each time I remembered them. I rose quietly from my bed, feeling the chill of the winter air pressing against my skin as I tiptoed through the dark hallway. Each creak of the floorboards echoed loudly in the silence, and I stopped several times, straining to hear if anyone else was awake. There was only the faint hum of the refrigerator, steady and indifferent. I approached the living room where the photos had been laid out. The shadows of the room were deeper at night, stretching along the walls and ceiling, bending in strange ways as the weak moonlight filtered through the curtains. I reached out slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the table, tracing the familiar scratches and imperfections. The texture of the wood grounded me, though the chill ran along my nerves. I picked up one of the photos again, studying the edges of the room captured in the image. There it was. The figure, always on the margins, partially hidden behind a chair, or in the corner, or just beneath the edge of a table. Its shape was vague, featureless, yet undeniably present. My breath caught. I felt a shiver move slowly from my shoulders down to my fingertips. I whispered to myself, almost involuntarily, "It's just a shadow. Just a trick of the light. I'm imagining it." But even as the words left my lips, I felt the pull of certainty in my chest, the quiet insistence that something in the photos was real, and it was not meant to be there. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing softly against my face, carrying a faint, metallic tang I could not place. I could hear the distant sound of the wind outside, brushing against the eaves, moving the bare branches of the trees. The faint rustle reminded me of a presence just beyond the walls, patient, waiting, silent. I placed the photo back on the table and stepped back slowly. My eyes flicked to the shadows in the room. For a moment I thought I saw movement, subtle and almost imperceptible, a shift near the edge of the couch, a bending of shadow that could have been the moonlight, but my mind refused to dismiss it entirely. I'm not imagining it. I'm seeing it. The thought tightened in my chest, slow and suffocating. I spent the next hour moving through the house slowly, deliberately, examining each familiar surface, listening to the faint creaks and hums. Everything was ordinary. Everything was familiar. And yet the unease pressed in from all sides, filling the spaces between the furniture, the shadows, the corners, the air itself. At some point, I realized I was talking to myself softly, almost in a whisper. Maybe it's always been like this. Maybe I never noticed before. Maybe they've always been there. The words echoed in the empty house, bouncing off walls and ceilings, leaving me with a silence that felt heavier than before. Finally, I returned to my room, leaving the photographs on the table, the figure's presence lingering in my mind. I lay down, feeling the chill of the sheets, the faint vibration of the house settling in the quiet hours before dawn. My thoughts circled endlessly, revisiting each photo, each figure, each shadow. And as sleep finally began to pull at the edges of my consciousness, I realized with a slow, insistent clarity, the figures were not part of memory alone. They were patient, watching, and they had always been there. The days after that night passed in a quiet tension. I found myself returning to the photo boxes again and again, studying them under the dim light of the living room lamp. Each picture seemed familiar, yet I noticed details I had missed before. The figures in the background were consistent, appearing in different years, in different rooms, always in the same vague posture, always watching, silent. I would trace their outlines with my eyes, comparing their subtle positions from year to year. Sometimes the figure was closer to a chair, sometimes behind a curtain, sometimes just a shadow in the corner. But they were always there, patient, almost deliberate. The realization sank into me slowly, like a weight settling in the pit of my stomach. These figures were not random. There was a pattern. I began to notice other small anomalies around the house, subtle things I had ignored before. A chair slightly out of place, a picture frame tilted at the edge of the shelf, a rug that felt different under my fingers. Each minor change, seemingly inconsequential, carried the same quiet weight as the figures in the photos. And each one reinforced the awareness that the house was not as ordinary as it seemed. One evening, I sat alone in the living room, the photo albums spread around me. I whispered to myself, softly, almost inaudibly, maybe it's my imagination. Maybe I'm seeing patterns that aren't there. Maybe it's nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, tightening slowly around my chest like a cold hand. My gaze flicked repeatedly to the shadows in the corners, half expecting to see something move. The air felt thicker, heavier, pressing softly against my skin. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a floorboard, the distant rustle of the wind against the windows, all of it seemed amplified. I could feel the rhythm of the house differently now, subtle shifts that were almost imperceptible yet impossible to ignore. I catalogued every detail: the texture of the carpet, the smoothness of the table, the faint chill in the corners of the room. Everything was familiar, and yet nothing felt safe. I caught myself talking softly to the figures in the photos, as if they might respond. "Why are you here? Who are you? What do you want?" But the silence returned each time, thick and patient, the presence of the unknown pressing at the edges of perception. I began to feel that the figures were not confined to the photographs alone. They were in the rhythm of the house, in the shifting shadows, in the faint, almost imperceptible cold that touched my skin. By the time night fell, I could no longer distinguish the line between memory and presence. The house exhaled around me, creaking softly, shadows stretching, shifting, lingering. The figures in the photos seemed to watch me in my mind's eye, patient, deliberate, inevitable. And I understood, with a slow, suffocating clarity, that the pattern was consolidating. It was no longer a subtle anomaly. It was a persistent, unyielding presence woven into the fabric of our lives. I left the albums spread on the table, returning to my room with deliberate, measured step. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me as I passed. I lay awake in bed, listening to the house breathe, counting the soft creaks and hums, feeling the tension settle into my chest like a weight I could not shift. And I knew, without fully understanding how, that the figures were patient, waiting, and their presence was inevitable. The pattern had begun, and I had no choice but to watch. The days after my discoveries passed in a haze of quiet dread. Every corner of the house seemed alive with subtle movements I could no longer ignore. A shadow flickering against the wall, the faint scrape of a chair, the whisper of wind through the cracks of the window, every sound and motion amplified the sense that the ordinary world I had trusted was unraveling. I tried to reason with myself. It's nothing. I'm overreacting. It's just shadows, just reflections, my imagination. But the certainty in the photos, the figures in the background, unchanged, patient, silent, refused to be rationalized away. They were too consistent, too deliberate. My mind circled endlessly, testing explanations, seeking comfort in the mundane. Yet every time I thought I had dismissed it, my chest tightened with quiet insistence. You are seeing what is there. You cannot unsee it. I began walking through the house slowly, deliberately, examining each room, tracing familiar surfaces with my fingers. The polished table, the textured carpet, the cold window sills. Each small detail grounded me momentarily, yet only made the anomalies stand out more sharply. Chairs slightly askew, pictures tilted, shadows pooling strangely. Every imperfection whispered that the house was no longer fully mine, no longer entirely ordinary. I spoke to myself quietly, softly, almost in a whisper. Maybe it's always been like this. Maybe I just never noticed. Maybe the figures are just memories. The words were comforting for a moment, but as soon as they left my lips, the weight returned, heavier and colder than before. My heart thudded slowly in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence, a rhythmic reminder that the pattern was consolidating, relentless, patient. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creak of the floorboards, the distant rustle of trees against the window. My thoughts twisted endlessly around the images in the photos. Familiar faces, familiar rooms, and always the figures in the background. I catalogued every detail in my mind, tracing subtle consistencies, noting their positions, the shadows they occupied. They were quiet, unchanging, and impossible to ignore. I began to feel a creeping guilt, slow and insistent. Should I have done something earlier? Should I have questioned my family? Should I have confronted it? Each question pressed against the edges of my mind, impossible to dismiss, impossible to answer. The awareness of my own inaction weighed heavily, a cold, subtle pressure that settled in my chest and did not relent. Even during the day, the feeling persisted. I would pass through the living room, glance at the table where the albums sat, and feel the invisible presence of the figures watching. I imagined them moving silently behind me, in the corners, just beyond the edges of my vision. Rationality whispered that it was impossible, that I was imagining it. But the certainty in my chest refused comfort. They are there. They have always been there. And I cannot stop it. I tried to distract myself with small tasks. Tidying the house, making tea, tracing the familiar rhythm of everyday life. But nothing could erase the awareness that the ordinary fabric of our home was interwoven with something patient, deliberate, inevitable. The figures in the photos were not just memories. They were warnings, markers of a pattern I had failed to disrupt. And in that quiet, patient tension, I understood the truth with a slow, suffocating clarity. The pattern was consolidating, the presence was consolidating, and I had done nothing. There was no sudden horror, no dramatic upheaval, only the relentless, invisible pressure of inevitability pressing softly, persistently, into every corner of the house, into every moment of my life. I lay awake through the night, listening to the subtle rhythm of the house, feeling the cold press against my skin, counting every creak, every whisper of movement. And I knew with a quiet, unyielding certainty that the next shift was coming, and when it did, my choices would no longer matter. The following New Year's Eve arrived quietly, like a tide that comes without warning yet slowly fills every corner. The house felt denser, heavier somehow, the air thick with faint scents of pine and wax, faint hints of the kitchen's lingering aromas. Shadows stretched along the walls and across the floorboards, shifting slowly as the weak moonlight spilled through the curtains. I moved deliberately through the rooms, each step careful, measured. The photographs lay spread across the living room table, open to years past. The figures were there, patient and silent, always in the background, always observing. I traced their outlines with my eyes, noting the faint changes from year to year. Each repetition pressed softly but insistently at the edges of my awareness, urging me to act, to notice, to correct. And yet, I did nothing. The rational part of me argued, softly, almost pleading, move the photos, rearrange the furniture, talk to your family, investigate. But another part, the part that had been growing silent and patient for weeks, whispered back, observe, sit quietly, let it unfold. I hesitated, feeling the weight of both possibilities pressing against my chest. My fingers hovered over the edges of the photographs, tracing their familiar textures. I could feel the cold, smooth paper beneath my skin, grounding me. I poured myself a cup of tea, the warmth a thin comfort against the tightening in my chest. The routine motions of the kettle, the mug, the gentle steam rising into the air, each one anchored me in the ordinary. I sipped slowly, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creak of the floorboards, the whisper of wind against the window pane. I told myself to breathe, to let reason guide me, to remember that it was all just photographs, just shadows, just memory. But deep down, I knew the truth. The figures were not confined to the photos. They were patient, deliberate, inevitable. They were woven into the fabric of our lives, threading themselves through moments I had once considered ordinary. Every choice I had made, every hesitation, every silent observation, had strengthened their presence. And now I had a simple, quiet decision to make. I chose inaction. I set the mug down, leaving the photographs where they lay. I returned to my seat, observing silently, letting the familiar rhythm of my family continue around me. No dramatic gesture, no confrontation, no interference. Only stillness. Only quiet observation. Only the small, deliberate choice to do nothing. The shadows in the corners seemed to settle around me, patient, almost approving in their silence. The air pressed softly against my face, carrying the faint, metallic edge of inevitability. I felt it press against my chest, not sharply, not violently, but persistently, inexorably. My inaction was now part of the pattern. My hesitation had weight. My choice, though mundane and simple, was final. I watched my family, noting their quiet routines. The soft hum of conversation, the careful placement of dishes, the small, habitual gestures of comfort. And I understood, with slow, suffocating clarity, that nothing I did now would alter the outcome. The pattern was patient, deliberate, and it had been strengthened by my quiet acceptance. I stayed there through the final moments before midnight, sipping tea, tracing shadows with my eyes, cataloging each subtle anomaly. The air was cold, the light dim, and the house exhaled softly around me. And I knew, without surprise, that the next shift would come, quietly, inevitably, as it always did. Morning arrived slowly, pale and muted, filtered through the thin curtains. The house was silent, heavier than usual, as if holding its breath. I rose from bed, feeling the winter chill pressing against my skin, the faint hum of the refrigerator grounding me in ordinary sound. The floor beneath my feet was cold, each step deliberate, measured, hesitant. The photographs remained on the table, edges curling slightly with age. I approached them cautiously, noticing once more the figures in the background, patient, consistent, unchanging. My fingers hovered over the paper, tracing textures I had memorized long ago, and yet their presence felt heavier than ever. The familiar warmth of the morning tea, the scent of pine from the tree outside, the soft rustle of the wind, all of it seemed overlaid with a subtle, persistent tension pressing quietly against my chest. And then I saw it. The space where someone should have been was empty. Not in a dramatic, violent way. Not in a moment of chaos. Simply absent. A chair sat pulled slightly from the table, an indentation in the carpet where warmth had been, a silence where a presence once existed. The absence was immediate, undeniable. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, in the chill brushing my skin, in the slow, pressing weight of inevitability. My family moved around me as if nothing had changed. They spoke softly, ate quietly, performed the rituals of their ordinary lives. No one acknowledged the emptiness. And in that silence, I understood the finality of my choice. I had done nothing. I had observed. I had waited. And now, the consequence had arrived, patient, deliberate, unavoidable. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces, tracing familiar textures. The polished edges of tables, the roughness of the carpet, the cold smoothness of window sills. Everything was unchanged. Everything was familiar. And yet nothing was the same. The quiet imprint of absence lingered in the air, in the shadows, in the very rhythm of the house. I returned to the living room, sitting in my usual chair, staring at the empty space across the table. The house seemed to exhale around me, the shadows stretching and shrinking softly, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the cracked window pane, all of it continuing, indifferent, patient. The figures in the photographs, the silent witnesses of years past, seemed closer now, woven into every fold of light and shadow. I realized, with slow, suffocating clarity, that the pattern would continue. It was patient, deliberate, indifferent to my awareness. My choices, my hesitation, my quiet observation had only reinforced it. Each passing new year, the figures would return. And the emptiness would grow, quietly, invisibly, unrelentingly. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint rhythm of the house, feeling the cold press against my skin. My thoughts circled endlessly, tracing the familiar pattern of absence, observation, inevitability. And in the quiet, patient tension, I understood that there would be no resolution, no explanation, no reprieve. The pattern was eternal, woven into the fabric of our lives, waiting for the next subtle shift, the next silent moment, the next new year. I opened my eyes again to the pale morning light, the empty chair, the quiet house. The silence stretched endlessly, unbroken, unyielding. And I waited, and the silence remained.